Alright then, so we can sign up, log in and log out from the front-end application now. And when we're logged in, we have that token stored in local storage. And we're also keeping our global auth state in sync with that, so that when we have a token present, the global user value is the email of the person logged in. And we're using that email in the navbar at the top when we are logged in. So this is all working. But there's still more things we need to do. First, I want to protect the workouts data from any user not logged in, so that if I was to log out of this site now, then I shouldn't be able to fetch the workouts data using the API. So we need to lock down those API routes that work with workouts data to make sure that only logged in users can access that data. Now to do this, we need to head back to the backend code and make some middleware. So the way this is going to work is that we're going to make a middleware function that fires for every single workouts route before the controller functions. And that middleware function is going to check that the user making the request is authenticated. And to do that, it needs to check if the request came loaded with the JSON Web Token for that user. If it did, it also needs to make sure that that token is valid and that it hasn't changed. If both of those criteria are passed, then we can allow access to the user to the workouts resource. If the token isn't present, or if it's present but we can't verify it, then instead we're going to prevent access and send back an error response. Alright then, so let's start over here by creating a new folder called middleware, and all of our middleware functions are going to go inside here. So I'll create a new file called require auth.js like so, and let me rename that just to give this an A. Okay, and inside here we'll create a constant called require auth and set it equal to a function. So this is the middleware function. We get access to request, response, and also the next function. Remember, we invoke the next function to move on to the next piece of middleware or the next handler. For example, these things down here once this middleware has run. Okay, so what do we want to do inside this function? Well, we want to verify that the user is authenticated, first of all. So let's do a comment and say verify authentication. Now, the way we're going to do this is by using an authorization headers property from the request. Now, we've not implemented that on the front end, but basically, on the request object, we get access to the headers. So you know things like content type is application JSON, all that kind of jazz. Well, one of those header properties is the authorization property. So we're going to grab that from the headers, and then later when we send requests, we're going to add that authorization property, and it will be our token. And we'll see that later. But for now, just know that we can grab this authorization property from the request headers, and that should contain our JSON Web Token. So let me say const destructure the authorization property from request headers. Now with that, we need to check the JSON Web Token. But first of all, we need to make sure that this has a value, because if from the front end, we're not sending this, for example, if I go to pages and then go to home, for example, if when we try to send this request for workouts, if we don't send the headers in this request and it doesn't have that authorization header, then we don't need to carry on any further. We need to check that first of all, that it exists, because if it doesn't have it, then we're just going to send some kind of error back. So I'm going to say if and then not authorization. So if we don't have a value for that, then we want to return response.status 401 and then also add some JSON to this with an error message. And the error is just going to say something like authorization token required. So authorization token required. All right, so we've done that first little step. We've checked that we have a value for this. The next thing we want to do is basically get the token from this thing, because we send the token as part of that request header. So how do we do that? Well, basically, the value of this, when we send it, is going to be a string. And it's going to look like this. It will say bearer, first of all, then a space, and then the token. So the three different parts of the token, yeah, like that, okay? So what we want is this part right here. So we need to split this string into two parts. This, and then this. And basically, we can discard this part of it, but we want this part of it. So what we can do is use the split method on this string, and that splits a string into an array. and we split it at a certain character so that when it comes across that character in this string, that's the point it splits it into its different elements. So I could say split by a space, and what that will do is split the string into an array of 2 elements, this thing on this side of the space and this thing on the other side of the space. So that's what we're going to do. So let me get rid of that, and I'm going to say the const token is equal to the authorization header dot split. So remember, that is the string I just showed you, and we're going to split at a space, and that creates the array for us. Now we just want the second item in that array, the actual token, not the first one. So remember, the first one is position 0, the second one, which is the token, is position 1, and that's what we want. So now we have the token. Alright, so what we want to do now is try and verify that token to make sure it's not been tampered with. Now to do this, we need to use the JSON Web Token package. So I'm going to go over here and import that at the top. So const JWT is equal to require JSON Web Token. This is the package we installed earlier in the course. So we need to try and do this because we're going to catch an error if there is one. So try and catch like so, and we place the error in here if there is one. So the thing that we want to try to do is to try and verify the token right here. And the way we do that is by saying JWT.verify, and then we pass in the token like so, and also the secret that we have on the server. Remember, that is in the environment variables, this thing, because it needs that secret to verify the signature. So we can say process.env.secret. So it verifies it for us, and it returns us the token or the payload from that token. So what we can do is grab the ID from that token from the payload by saying const underscore ID is equal to this. So it grabs the ID from this thing, right? Now, if there's an error, if it can't verify that, then we catch that error down here, in which case we'll log that error to the console, console.log error, and then below that I'm going to say response.status, and then the status is going to be 401, and then we're going to send some JSON back with an error, and that error is going to say request is not authorized. Alright, so if this works, if it verifies, then we have the ID available to us. Now what I want to do is use the ID from the payload to try and find this user in the database. So I'm going to say request.user is equal to something. Now the reason I'm doing this is because we have this request object right here, and all I'm doing is attaching the user property to that request, so that when we go on to the next piece of middleware, for example, one of these workout handler functions right here, these controller functions, on the request object in those functions, we're going to have this user property because we're attaching it in this function, which runs first. So we set that equal to await, and then we need the user model. So we need to import that at the top of the file. I'll do that right here. So const user is equal to require models user model. So we take the user and we want to find one. And the thing we want to find is by the ID that we have, so underscore ID. So that gets us that particular user. And also what I want to do is only basically attach the ID property to this. So I can say, for example, .select, and then inside here, I can say underscore ID. So now, instead of this returning the entire document for us with all the properties like the email, the hashed password, the ID, etc., now it just returns us a slimmed down document with just the ID property on it, because we don't need those other properties like the email or the hashed password. So now this user will just have an ID or underscore ID property on it, and we can use that in those other controller functions to do something with it. So let me come down here and then say next, and what this will do is then fire the next handler function. So dead quickly, from the top we have this function. It's not actually running anywhere yet because we've not registered it as middleware, but we have this function that takes in these three things: request, response, and next. We get the authorization headers, we check that that has a value. If it doesn't, we send an error. If it does have a value, we get the token from the authorization header using the split method. Then down here we try something, and the thing we try is to grab the ID from the token. Now We do that by verifying the token right here, passing in the token and also the secret. So if this is a success, then it's going to return us right here this ID from the payload. And with the ID, we then try and find that user in the database and we just select the ID property from it. And then the resulting document or object is stored now as the user property on the request object. And by the way, that could be called anything, ABC if you want. I'm calling it user. So now this will have an ID property or underscore ID property on it. So that when we call next right here and it goes to the next function, like for example, one of these functions, if we open up our controllers and go to workouts controller. So for example, in here, this will now have a user property. And on that user property will be the underscore ID property. So if we need it inside this function, we can do. We know that user is authenticated. So that's if this is a success. If it's not a success, if this is not verified and something's happened with the token, then we're going to log the error down here and also send an error back to the client saying request is not authorized. So that's the function done. We need to also export it at the bottom. So module.export is equal to require auth. And then we need to use this in our workouts routes over here. So first of all, what I'm going to do is import that middleware function. So I'll say const require auth is equal to require, and then it's ... to come out of the current folder, the routes folder, then into the middleware folder. Then we want require auth. And then what we want to do after we instantiate this router, we want to say router.use require auth. And what that's going to do is basically fire this middleware function before all of this stuff right here, because we want to protect all of these things. So if a user wants to get all workouts or a single one, post a new one, delete one, or update one, they have to be authenticated. And this is going to ensure that, because if they're not authenticated inside this function, then we're going to send back an error in one of these two cases. And it never actually gets to these controller functions. If they are authenticated, we attach that user to the request object and we call next. And that will then fire the appropriate function here, because this has now passed. Does that make sense? So let's do a little comment here to say what this is. Require auth for all workout routes. All right. So now let me save this. And now I do want to try this out in Postman, but before we do, I've just noticed an error on my other screen, and that's because we've not made this function async, and it needs to be async because we use await down here. So now let me save this again, and we're going to try this now in Postman. Alright then, so in Postman, I'm going to send a request to workouts, which is now protected with that middleware. So if we're not authenticated, we shouldn't be able to access this data. And the same for all of these other endpoints as well, to access a single workout or to add a new workout, delete one, etc. So let's just try this one. So if I send over here, then we can see the authorization token is required. So the way we add an auth token from Postman is just by going to auth and then go to bearer token, and then we can add some kind of token in here. Now, if I add any old token like this that's not valid, I'm going to press send, and then it says the request is not authorized because this isn't a valid token. However, now if I go to log in as someone, I'm going to send this request to log in as this person, and I'm going to grab this token right here and copy it. Now this is a valid token, right? So let me get rid of that and then paste it in and send this. And now we can see, because it's valid, we get all of that workout data back. So now we're protecting this route, this endpoint, and all these others the same way from unauthenticated users. So you have to be logged in now and have that token and send it with the request in order to access any of this data or do anything with it. So in the next lesson, what we'll do is we'll hook this up from the front end to start making these authorized requests.